Almost everyone who knows the Art of Fugue thinks they know how the story ends. Johann Sebastian Bach is old. His eyesight is failing. He's writing the final fugue of what many consider to be his greatest work. Then something extraordinary happens. He introduces a new subject built from the musical letters of his own name, Bach. And then the manuscript stops. A few months later, Bach is dead. It's one of the most enduring stories in classical music. Like many musicians, I accepted that story without giving it much thought. It appeared so often in program notes, books, recordings and documentaries that I simply assumed it reflected what the surviving evidence told us. Then I recorded the Art of Fugue. In July 2025, I had the privilege of recording much of the work on the Metzler organ of Trinity College, Cambridge. Before that, I'd lived with the music for years as a performer, on the organ, the harpsichord and the piano. But spending months preparing and recording it changed the way I listened. The closer I became to the music, the less convinced I was that its unfinished final page should dominate the way we understand it. Instead, I found myself drawn to a different question. Not how the story ends, but how he came to tell that story in the first place. That question led me back to the surviving manuscripts, the first printed edition of 1751, and to generations of Bach scholars who have tried to understand what these sources really tell us, and just as importantly, what they don't. This documentary isn't an attempt to solve one of music's greatest mysteries. Instead, it's an invitation to look again at the evidence, to listen again to the music, and to ask whether the Art of Fugue might be richer and more surprising than a familiar story allows. Throughout the film you hear excerpts from my own recording, not simply as a soundtrack, but as part of the conversation. Because for me, the Art of Fugue stopped being just a historical puzzle. It became one of the richest musical journeys I've ever experienced. Where that journey ultimately leads is for each of us to decide, but I hope that by the end you'll hear this remarkable work with fresh ears. Every great work of art acquires stories. At first, those stories help us understand the work. Over time, they become part of the work itself. Sometimes they become so familiar that we stop asking where they came from. I think that's exactly what has happened with the Art of Fugue. Most musicians know the traditional account of Bach's final fugue. We don't usually question it. We inherit it from teachers, books, recordings and program notes, and eventually it begins to feel less like a story than a historical fact. But history rarely works like that. The closer I looked, the more I realized there was a more interesting question than simply asking whether the familiar account is true. Where did it actually come from? For years, I assumed the answer would be found in Bach's own manuscript. It seemed the obvious place to begin. Instead, I discovered that the story we usually tell is built from several different sources, each contributing something slightly different. The surviving manuscript edition includes a brief handwritten note associated with the unfinished fugue. Then, the year after Bach's death, the first printed edition of the Art of Fugue appeared. It contains a much fuller editorial account connecting Bach's failing eyesight and his death with the point where the manuscript breaks off. That account has shaped the way generations of musicians have understood the work. It's an enormously important source. Without it, the familiar story would look very different. But like every historical document, it has to be read carefully. Before asking what it means, we first have to ask exactly what it says. The handwritten note is usually attributed to Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. That seems entirely plausible. Its precise history, however, is rather more complicated than it's sometimes presented. Historical research often advances through distinctions that seem minor at first. Good historians don't simply collect evidence, they ask where it came from, who wrote it, when it was written, why it was written, and what it can reasonably tell us. That doesn't diminish the importance of these early documents, quite the opposite. It helps us understand them more clearly. One of the things that surprised me while reading the scholarship was how much agreement there actually is. Scholars generally agree about the surviving sources themselves. Where they sometimes differ is in deciding what those sources allow us to conclude. That's an important distinction. Evidence and interpretation are closely connected, but they aren't the same thing. None of this tells us that the familiar story is wrong. It may prove to be substantially correct. But it does remind us that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. The closer we move towards the original sources, the more careful we have to become. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because the real fascination of the Art of Fugue isn't that it leaves us with easy answers, is that it invites us to ask better questions. So before we think about unfinished fugues or Bach's final months, or what might once have existed beyond the last surviving page, we need to look carefully at what actually survives. That's where every historical investigation begins, and it's where ours begins too. Whenever historians investigate the past, they begin with the same simple question: what survives? Not what later generations believed, not what would like to be true, simply what remains. That sounds straightforward. In practice, it rarely is. Time has a habit of preserving some things while allowing others to disappear. What survives is seldom the whole story. It's the fragmentary record from which historians try to reconstruct it. The Art of Fugue is no exception. When I first began reading about the Art of Fugue, I imagined there would be one definitive manuscript that explained everything. Instead, I found a small family of related sources. At the centre stands Bach's autographed manuscript. It's the closest thing we possess to the composer's own working copy, preserving not only the music itself, but traces of the way he composed, revised, and reorganised the collection. Alongside it is the first printed edition, published in 1751 after Bach's death. It preserves music that doesn't survive in the autograph, but it also contains editorial material that has shaped almost everything we think we know about the work. Then there are later manuscript copies. Some preserve readings found nowhere else. Others tell us something about how the collection circulated among Bach's family, pupils, and early admirers. Each source contributes something. None tells the whole story. One of the biggest surprises for me was discovering how much historians can learn without analysing a single note of music. They study the paper, the handwriting, the ink, the watermarks hidden inside the sheets, even the order in which the pages were assembled. At first, that level of detail can seem almost obsessive. Then you realise why it matters. A manuscript isn't simply a container for music. It's a physical record of a composer's working life. Every correction tells us something. Every revision suggests a decision. Even a change of ink can reveal that Bach returned to the manuscript after setting it aside. None of these details solves the mystery of the Art of Fugue. Together, however, they reveal something even more interesting. They allow us to watch Bach thinking. As I spent more time with the manuscript, one impression became increasingly difficult to escape. This wasn't a composer copying out a finished masterpiece for publication. It was a composer still working. Several fugues were revised, others were expanded. The order of the collection continued to evolve. That doesn't mean we can always reconstruct exactly what Bach intended. The surviving evidence rarely offers that degree of certainty. But it does reveal something deeply human. One of history's greatest composers was still experimenting, still refining, still discovering new possibilities within the same remarkable musical idea. I found that strangely encouraging. We often think of masterpieces as though they arrive fully formed. The manuscript tells a different story. It shows us creativity as a process. Looking at the manuscript changed the way I listened. Instead of hearing a sequence of isolated fugues, I began to hear a composer exploring an idea over many years. The collection became less like a finished monument and more like a conversation. Each fugue seemed to respond to those that came before it. Each discovered new possibilities hidden within the same deceptively simple subject. Whether Bach planned every stage of that journey from the outset is something the surviving documents cannot tell us. The music, however, creates an extraordinary impression of coherence. However Bach arrived there, the surviving collection possesses a remarkable unity. And that raises another question. If the Art of Fugue wasn't simply an unfinished manuscript, what sort of work was Bach actually creating? The manuscript tells us a great deal, but it also leaves one of the most intriguing questions unanswered. Why did Bach choose to write this extraordinary collection in open score? And why do the surviving sources never tell us which instrument he expected us to play? Those questions have fascinated performers for nearly 3 centuries. They're where our journey leads next. By this point, we spent quite a lot of time looking at documents. They've told us how the Art of Fugue developed. They've shown us something of Bach's working methods. They've helped us understand where the familiar story comes from. But they leave one important question unanswered. What sort of work is this? Is it organ music, harpsichord music, music for strings? Or are we asking the wrong question altogether? One of the most remarkable things about the Art of Fugue is that Bach never tells us. There is no title page naming an instrument, no preface explaining how it should be performed, no registrations, no instrumentation, just the music itself. At first that can seem frustrating. Gradually I began to think it might be one of the work's greatest strengths. Part of the mystery lies in the notation itself. Instead of writing on a familiar 2-stave used for most keyboard music, Bach gives each voice its own line. Musicians know this as open score. Today it looks unusual. In Bach's own time it wasn't. Open score had long been associated with the teaching and presentation of counterpoint, allowing each individual voice to be followed with exceptional clarity. For a long time that encouraged the idea that the Art of Fugue was primarily a theoretical work, a treatise, a demonstration of compositional technique. The more I lived with it though, the harder that became to believe. Nothing about these fugues feels abstract. They breathe, they sing, they surprise, they build tension, they relax. They're full of energy and imagination. The notation may invite careful study. The music insists on being heard. That may be exactly the point. Bach never asks us to choose between the eye and the ear. He invites both. Maybe that's why performers have never settled on a single instrument. Over the last 3 centuries, the Art of Fugue has been played on organ, harpsichord, piano, string quartet, wind ensemble, orchestra, and almost everything in between. Each performance sounds different. Each reveals different colours, different balances, different possibilities. Yet something remarkable remains unchanged. The musical argument survives. Eventually I realised I'd been asking the wrong question. Not, which instrument did Bach intend, but what does each instrument allow us to hear? That small shift changed everything. Instead of searching for a single definitive performance, I began to appreciate the different ways performers illuminate the same extraordinary architecture. Great music doesn't become smaller because it's viewed from different perspectives. Quite the opposite. Each thoughtful performance helps us notice something we hadn't heard before. Recording the Art of Fugue changed the way I listened. Before I began, I expected to spend most of my time thinking about practical questions. Tempo, balance, registration, articulation, those decisions certainly mattered. But gradually something else began to happen. Instead of concentrating on individual fugues, I found myself becoming increasingly aware of the relationships between them. Ideas introduced almost casually will return much later transformed. Textures became richer. The writing grew steadily more adventurous. The collection began to feel less like 20 separate pieces and more like one long musical journey. Not one travelling in a straight line, but one continually returning to the same musical idea and discovering fresh possibilities every time. Whether Bach planned every stage of that journey from the beginning is something we simply cannot know. What I can say is that as a performer, it became almost impossible not to hear the collection as a remarkably coherent whole. That was one of the greatest surprises of the entire project. Perhaps that's why debates about the correct instrument never quite reach a conclusion. They're interesting, they're worthwhile, but they aren't the heart of the work. The longer I spent with the Art of Fugue, the less interested I became in assigning individual fugues to particular instruments. Instead, I found myself listening to the architecture of the collection itself. A great cathedral isn't understood by studying a single stone. You understand it by walking through the building. Perhaps the Art of Fugue asks something similar of us. Each fugue is complete in itself, yet each one gains meaning from those around it. The opening subject never really disappears. It keeps returning, sometimes almost unchanged, sometimes transformed beyond recognition. Each return invites us to hear the opening afresh. Each transformation changes our understanding of what has gone before. That, I think, is one of Bach's greatest achievements. The music continues to surprise us, not because it changes, but because our listening changes. By now, I had stopped thinking about the Art of Fugue simply as an extraordinary feat of counterpoint. Instead, I found myself asking a rather different question. Why does this music continue to affect us so deeply? History has helped us understand where the work came from. Performance has helped us understand how it speaks. But neither fully explains why it still has the power to move us. To answer that, we need to move beyond manuscripts, beyond instruments, and begin thinking about meaning itself. So far, we've asked mostly historical questions. Where did this work come from? How did it develop? What did the surviving sources tell us? How might Bach have expected it to be performed? Those are important questions. Without them, we'd understand the Art of Fugue far less well. But eventually, I found myself wondering about something rather different. Not simply how Bach wrote this music, but why it continues to affect us. Because technical brilliance, remarkable though it is, can only take us so far. History explains where the work came from. It doesn't fully explain why generations of musicians continue returning to it. No one would deny that the Art of Fugue represents one of the supreme achievements of contrapuntal writing. Every page demonstrates astonishing craftsmanship. Simple musical ideas generate extraordinary complexity. It's impossible not to admire. But admiration isn't the same thing as understanding, nor is it quite the same as being moved. Music can be ingenious without becoming unforgettable. What has always struck me about the Art of Fugue is that its intellectual discipline never feels separate from its expressive power. The counterpoint doesn't restrain the music, it releases it. The more closely I listened, the less I found myself separating technique from expression. Each seemed to illuminate the other. The discipline gives the music its strength. The imagination gives it life. That may be one reason the work continues to reward repeated listening. Each return reveals relationships that weren't obvious before. Not because the music has changed, but because we have. The longer I live with this music, the more I notice something else. Everything seems to grow from remarkably modest beginnings. A single subject, a handful of intervals, an idea simple enough to remember after hearing it only once. Again and again, Bach returns to that same material, never mechanically, never predictably. Each return reveals another possibility. Nothing feels wasted, nothing feels arbitrary. Listening to the collection as a whole, I found myself less impressed by its complexity than by its extraordinary economy. So much imagination, drawn from so little material. That may be one of the reasons the work feels so unified, not because every detail was necessarily planned from the outset, but because Bach continually discovers fresh possibilities within the same musical world. Reading the scholarship, I realised that historians often ask a rather different question. Not simply how the music works, but what it might mean. Heinrich Eggebrecht argued that the Art of Fugue possesses a remarkable artistic unity. One would advise us to hear it as more than a sequence of contrapuntal demonstrations. Other historians have been more cautious, reminding us how easily modern listeners can project meanings onto the music that the historical evidence cannot support. I find both approaches persuasive. One encourages us to take the work seriously as a coherent artistic whole. The other reminds us to remain disciplined in our interpretations. That balance matters, because once we move beyond the surviving documents, certainty becomes increasingly difficult. The music undoubtedly invites reflection. Exactly what it signifies remains something each listener must decide. After spending so much time in the Art of Fugue, I don't feel I've solved it. If anything, it's become more mysterious. Not because I understand the evidence less well, quite the opposite. It's because the music continues to reveal new relationships every time I return to it. That may be one of the defining characteristics of a masterpiece. Not that it gives us all the answers, but it continues to ask new questions. Every generation hears the work through its own experiences. The score remains unchanged. We are the ones who change. And perhaps that is why this music never seems exhausted. The more closely we listen, the more generously it responds. We've deliberately resisted beginning with the unfinished fugue. Instead, we've taken a longer route. We've looked at the surviving sources. We've explored the remarkable unity of the collection. We've asked what sort of work Bach created and why it continues to speak so powerfully today. Only now do we arrive at the final fugue itself. Not because it's the whole story, but because we finally see it as part of something much larger. The manuscript still poses difficult questions. Some may never be answered with complete certainty. But we're now in a better position to understand both what the surviving evidence can tell us and what it cannot. That is where our journey reaches its final stage. At last, we arrive at the fugue that has shaped almost everything we've discussed. For many listeners, this is the Art of Fugue, the unfinished masterpiece, the work Bach never completed. Even without knowing anything about the manuscript or the history that surrounds it, the music immediately feels different. the scale is larger, the argument more ambitious. Everything suggests that Bach is moving towards something extraordinary. 3 principal subjects gradually unfold. Each has its own distinct character. Each opens up new possibilities. Long before the manuscript breaks off, there's already a sense that we've reached the summit of the collection. It's easy to understand why generations of musicians have heard this as Bach's final musical statement. The music itself encourages that impression. Then comes the moment almost everyone remembers. Almost unnoticed within the texture, a new subject emerges. Using the German names of the notes, B flat, A, C, B natural, together they spell B-A-C-H. It's one of the most famous musical signatures in Western music. Bach wasn't the first composer to use these 4 notes, nor was he the last. But nowhere have they acquired greater significance than here. It's tempting to hear this as the destination of everything that has come before. Listening carefully though, I hear something slightly different. The motive doesn't interrupt the music, it grows naturally out of it. Rather than bringing the argument to its conclusion, it feels like the beginning of another stage in the journey. Many scholars believe Bach intended eventually to combine these 3 subjects with the original Art of Fugue subject in a climactic quadruple fugue. The surviving manuscript breaks off before we discover whether that was indeed his plan. This is where the surviving manuscript ends. Not with a final cadence, not with a concluding flourish, simply with music unfinished. It's one of the most haunting images in the history of music. For a long time I assumed the meaning was obvious. Bach died. The fugue remained incomplete. End of story. The manuscript itself tells us only where the music stops. It doesn't tell us why it stops. That distinction changes everything. The familiar story comes from the earliest documents associated with the work. A brief handwritten note, generally attributed to Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, accompanies the autographed manuscript and links the break in the unfinished fugue with Bach's death. The first printed edition of 1751 expands that account, telling readers that failing eyesight and the composer's death prevented the fugue from being completed. Those documents are enormously important. Without them, we would understand the Art of Fugue very differently. At the same time, they have to be read as historical documents rather than eyewitness transcripts. Like every source, they tell us some things with confidence, others they leave unanswered. They don't tell us how much of the fugue had already been composed. They don't tell us whether additional sketches once existed, nor do they tell us whether Bach regarded the collection as complete before his death. Those are questions that extend beyond the surviving evidence. Modern Bach scholarship doesn't avoid those questions. It simply recognizes that the documents cannot answer them with certainty. I found that approach unexpectedly reassuring. It reminded me that careful scholarship isn't about eliminating uncertainty. It's about recognizing where certainty ends. Perhaps the most important distinction I encountered during my research was also one of the simplest. We're looking at an unfinished manuscript. Whether that necessarily means we're looking at an unfinished work is another question. Those 2 ideas are often treated as though they were identical. They aren't. Some scholars are convinced Bach intended to finish the fugue. Others have suggested that the surviving collection already possesses its own artistic completeness. Those views need not be mutually exclusive. A single movement may remain unfinished. The larger work may nevertheless achieve an extraordinary sense of fulfillment. As a performer, that became increasingly important to me. The emotional power of the Art of Fugue doesn't depend solely on its final page. It depends on everything that leads towards it. Without the preceding contrapuncti, the silence at the end wouldn't affect us in quite the same way. The journey gives meaning to the ending, not the other way round. When the time came to make my own recording, I had to decide where to end. Should I perform one of the many published completions, or should I stop where the manuscript stops? Both choices have distinguished advocates. Many completions are remarkable achievements. They represent generations of musicians trying to imagine how Bach might have continued. I admire them enormously, but they answer a different question from the one I wanted my recording to ask. Throughout this project, I've tried, wherever possible, to begin with what survives. The manuscript survives. The silence survives. The later completions belong to the remarkable history of the work's reception. They tell us a great deal about those who created them. They cannot tell us with certainty what Bach himself intended. For that reason, I chose to let the manuscript have the final word, or perhaps its final silence. When I began this project, I thought the great mystery of the Art of Fugue lay in its unfinished ending. I don't think that any longer. The manuscript still breaks off. The early editorial accounts remain indispensable. Scholars will no doubt continue debating exactly what they imply. Those discussions matter. They help us understand the history of the work more clearly. But somewhere along the way my attention shifted. The unfinished page stopped being the destination. Instead, it became one part of a much larger musical landscape. A landscape built from astonishing invention, extraordinary discipline, and an imagination unlike anything else Bach ever wrote. Whether the final fugue was destined to continue, or whether the surviving collection already says everything Bach wished it to say, is a question we may never answer to everyone's satisfaction. And perhaps that's all right, because the deeper mystery isn't why the manuscript stops. It's how music built from such simple material continues to reveal something new every time we return to it. The manuscript falls silent. The music does not. When I finished recording the Art of Fugue, I expected to understand it better. In one sense, I did. I understood more about the manuscripts, more about the surviving sources, more about the remarkable scholarship that has shaped our understanding of this extraordinary work. But those weren't the discoveries that stayed with me. The greatest surprise was that the music had become more mysterious, not less. Not because the evidence had become less clear, if anything the opposite. The more closely I read the sources, the more I came to appreciate what they genuinely tell us and what they cannot. I stopped looking for certainty where the evidence simply doesn't allow it. Oddly enough, I found that liberating. History doesn't always leave us with definitive answers. Sometimes it leaves us with better questions, and perhaps music does the same. Living with this music over many years also changed the way I listened. The individual fugues gradually disappeared. Not literally, of course. Each still has its own character, its own technical challenges, its own expressive world. But together they began to feel like something larger, a single musical landscape. The opening subject never seemed to disappear. Instead, it kept returning in new forms, revealing possibilities I hadn't noticed before. I realized that I had stopped listening for individual moments of brilliance. Instead, I was listening for relationships. Perhaps that's one of the reasons this music continues to fascinate performers. It refuses to be exhausted. Every return reveals another connection, another perspective, another way of hearing the same extraordinary material. This film hasn't tried to solve one of music's greatest mysteries. I don't think anyone honestly can. The surviving sources simply don't answer every question we might like to ask. They tell us where the manuscript ends. They preserve early attempts to explain why. Beyond that, we enter the world of interpretation. That isn't a weakness, it's simply the nature of historical inquiry. Good scholarship doesn't eliminate uncertainty, it teaches us how to live with it. As performers, perhaps we understand that instinctively. Every performance is itself an interpretation, grounded in evidence, shaped by experience, offered with humility. When I began this project, I thought I was making a film about an unfinished fugue. I no longer think that. I think it's really a film about listening carefully to historical documents, listening carefully to the scholarship, listening carefully to performers, and above all, listening carefully to Bach. Because somewhere along the way, the unfinished final page stopped feeling like the centre of the work. Instead, it became one moment within a much larger journey, a journey through music of astonishing imagination, music that continues to reveal new possibilities nearly 3 centuries after it was written. Thank you for joining me.